Think about the year 1948. The war ended 3 years ago, but walking through most of Britain, you wouldn't always know it. Rationing is still in place. Bread is still on the list. Clothes are rationed. Petrol is tight. Cities are still carrying their wounds. Bomb sites turned into makeshift car parks or sad patches of weeds where whole streets once stood. Families are rebuilding their lives in careful stages, slowly, deliberately, with very little room for error. And into that exhausted, quietly defiant Britain, a car was born. Not a flashy car, not a car designed to project an image of success you hadn't quite earned yet. This was a car born from necessity, from the genuine, unromantic human need for affordable, reliable, honest transportation. Something that would start every morning without drama. Something that could carry a family of 4 on a Sunday without complaint. Something designed to last not just a year or 2, but a decade or more without bleeding the owner dry in repair bills and replacement parts. That car was the Morris Minor. And here is what most people never tell you about it. Not in the museum displays, not in the classic car magazines, not even in most of the official histories written about the British motor industry. This was not just a well-engineered small car. It was a philosophical statement, a quiet but direct challenge to the direction the entire automobile industry was heading. Built at a moment when the people who would buy it had already spent years watching things fall apart around them, their cities, their certainties, their plans, and who had earned the right to something that would simply hold together. Behind this car was a man unlike almost anyone else in British engineering at the time, an outsider. Born in Smyrna, what is today Izmir, in Turkey, in 1910. He came to Britain as a young man, taught himself to think in shapes and proportions before he thought in numbers, and believed with a quiet, stubborn certainty that a vehicle should exist to serve the person driving it, not the shareholder, not the marketing department, the driver. His name was Alec Issigonis, and before this story is over, you will understand why that name deserves far more recognition than it usually gets. In 1948, a Morris Minor cost £358. The average British factory worker earned roughly £7 to £8 a week. Not cheap, but reachable, plannable. For the first time, a genuinely capable, well-handling, honestly built small car was within reach of the man who actually needed it most. That distinction matters more than it might sound. Stay with me, because where this story goes next is something most people have never heard. The story of the Morris Minor begins as so many great things do in a place of disruption and loss. Alec Issigonis was born in 1910 in Smyrna, a port city on the Aegean coast that was then part of the Ottoman Empire. His father was a British naturalized Greek marine engineer. His grandfather had worked with machines too. Engineering ran in his blood before he could properly hold a pencil. When the Greek-Turkish War tore the region apart in the early 1920s, the family fled. Young Alec came to Britain and eventually enrolled at Battersea Polytechnic in London. He failed his mathematics examination 3 times. By his own account, he was never a natural theoretician. What he had instead was something rarer and harder to teach, the ability to see a finished design in his mind as a complete 3-dimensional object, and then draw it freehand from pure imagination in extraordinary detail. He joined Morris Motors in 1936, and during the Second World War, with the factory converted to military production, he began sketching quietly, on the side, what a post-war small car for ordinary British people could and should look like. He called the project the Mosquito. The drawings were done largely by hand, often on whatever paper was nearby. No computer simulations, no focus groups, no research budget to speak of, just a man, a pencil, and a very clear idea about what driving should feel like. What Issigonis wanted was radical for its era, a wide, low body for stability. Rack and pinion steering, a system that gave far better road feel and precision than the worm and peg setups every other manufacturer was still relying on. Unitary body construction, which made the car stiffer and lighter without adding cost, independent front suspension. He wanted the Miner to handle like a car that cost twice as much and to last like something built by a man who genuinely cared whether it would still be running 10 years down the road. When the prototype was finally presented to William Morris, Lord Nuffield himself, the man whose name was above the factory door, the reaction was not what Issigonis had hoped for. Nuffield looked at the wide, rounded body, the low roofline, the friendly and unconventional proportions, and reportedly dismissed it on the spot. The words he used have since become something of a legend in British automotive history. He called it, quite plainly, a poached egg. He hated it. But here is the thing about Lord Nuffield's opinion. It mattered far less than he assumed, because the British public was about to see this car for the first time at the Earl's Court Motor Show in 1948, and they were going to disagree with him entirely. Sometimes, the man who owns the company is the last person who understands what people actually need. The 1948 Earl's Court Motor Show, London, October. The Morris Minor made its public debut, and the reaction was immediate. People gathered around it. They sat in it. They walked slowly around the outside, running their hands along the curves. It looked different from everything else on that floor rounder, more considered, more human. It didn't look like something designed in a hurry by a committee. It looked like something that had been thought about deeply. But there is a detail about that launch car, something almost nobody talks about today, that tells you everything about what happens when engineering vision collides with commercial reality. Issigonis had designed the Morris Minor with its headlights mounted low and inward, positioned in the center of the front grille. An unusual placement that gave the car an almost purposeful, forward-staring expression. He had reasoned it through carefully. It was part of the design's internal logic, not just a stylistic choice. The problem was North America. The United States had specific regulations about headlight height and positioning that the original design did not meet. If Morris wanted to sell the Minor in the American market, and they very much needed those export numbers, the headlights had to move. They were relocated outward, mounted higher on either side of the grille in a more conventional arrangement. Issigonis was reportedly furious. He considered it a compromise that undermined the visual integrity of everything he had designed. But the export market won. And honestly, most people who look at a Morris Minor today would probably say the revised front end is one of the most immediately recognizable and genuinely charming faces in the history of British motoring. Sometimes a forced compromise lands better than anyone expected. Now, the engine. This is where things get uncomfortable. For all the brilliance of the Minor's chassis, suspension and steering, the engine it launched with in 1948 was a disappointment. It was a side valve unit carried over directly from the pre-war Morris 8, a design already considered outdated before the war had ended. It produced around 27 brake horsepower. For a car this well conceived and this well handling, it was like fitting a thoroughbred with the wrong shoes. It wasn't until 1952 that the Morris Minor received the engine it had deserved from the beginning, an overhead valve 803 cubic centimeter unit shared with the New Austin A30. The improvement was real and immediate. The car finally had the mechanical foundation that matched everything else Issigonis had built into it. And that rack and pinion steering? Most British family cars wouldn't adopt it until the 1970s. The Minor had it from 1948. Issigonis was thinking 2 decades ahead, even when the engine he was handed had one foot firmly in the past. That tension between the brilliance of the design and the limitations imposed on it never quite went away, and it would follow this car all the way to the end. When a car gets the combination right, the right size, the right price, the right reliability, in the right moment, something unusual starts to happen. It stops being just a product. It becomes part of the landscape, part of the daily routine, part of the texture of memory for an entire generation. That is exactly what happened to the Morris Minor. From the original 2-door saloon that debuted in 1948, the range expanded steadily. A four-door version arrived in 1950, giving families more practical access without changing what the car was at its core. A convertible, officially called the Tourer, brought open-air motoring to people who had never imagined they could afford it. And then, in 1953, came the variant that would arguably become the most distinctive of them all, the Morris Minor Traveller. An estate car, what Americans would call a station wagon, with a rear structure made partly from structural ash wood, the same pale, dense hardwood used in traditional British furniture and coach building. The wood was not decorative trim, it was load-bearing. It physically held the rear of the car together. Each variant found its place naturally. The saloons became the family car of choice for working households across the country. The Tourer became a weekend companion. The Traveller became the vehicle of country doctors, school teachers, and farmers who needed something that could carry both passengers and equipment without looking purely commercial. And then there was the van. The Morris Minor panel van was adopted in enormous numbers by the General Post Office, the GPO, which ran Britain's entire postal and telephone infrastructure. If you grew up anywhere in Britain during the 1950s or 1960s, there is a very strong chance that a Morris Minor van came to your street, possibly to your front door. For millions of people, it was one of the first vehicles they ever saw up close as a small child. If you've been finding value in this kind of story, the real history behind the machines and the people who built them, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel. Hit the button below, leave a comment telling me what you remember about the Morris Minor. Maybe your family owned one, maybe you drove one yourself. Maybe it's just a shape from a memory you hadn't thought about in years. Like the video if it's been worth your time. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of history, share it with them. Now, back to where we were. Because in 1961, something happened that no British car had ever achieved before. The Morris Minor became the first British car in history to sell 1 million units. 350 special cars were produced in a commemorative lilac color and distributed to employees and dealers. That milestone wasn't a marketing exercise. It was a genuine measure of how deeply a small, honest, carefully made car had embedded itself into the life of an entire nation. And then the 1960s arrived, and the world changed faster than anyone had quite prepared for. Youth culture exploded across Britain and America. A new generation, the first that hadn't grown up, shaped by wartime austerity, started making its own decisions about what mattered. American cars were getting longer, wider, louder, tail fins, chrome, power. The message from Detroit was simple and relentless. Bigger is better, newer is better, more is always better. And British youth began listening. The Morris Minor, in that context, had a problem. It looked like something your father drove, and in the 1960s, that was not a compliment. But the real threat didn't come from across the Atlantic. It came from the man who had designed the Minor himself. In 1959, Alec Issigonis unveiled the BMC Mini front-wheel drive, transverse-mounted engine. A revolutionary approach to interior space that made a car barely 10 feet long genuinely practical for 4 adults. It was even cheaper than the Minor. It was sharper to drive. It felt younger, faster, more alive, and it became, almost overnight, one of the most culturally significant cars in the history of British motoring. The man who built the Morris Minor had, with surgical precision, made it obsolete. Sit with that for a moment. The same mind, the same philosophy that a car should be honest, functional, and serve the real person behind the wheel. But the execution had leaped forward by a full generation. The Minor was the foundation. The Mini was the revolution built on top of it. And foundations, by their nature, tend to get buried under what comes next. Sales of the Morris Minor continued through the 1960s. It still had loyal buyers, still held the rural and commercial market, still kept its connection with the Royal Mail. But the trajectory was impossible to ignore. The range was not being updated. Investment was flowing elsewhere. The car was aging in a decade that had very little patience for anything that felt old. And then came the decision that many historians believe truly sealed its fate. In 1968, the British Motor Corporation, BMC, parent company of both Morris and Austin since 1952, merged with Leyland Motors to form British Leyland. One of the largest industrial mergers in British history, and, in the judgment of most people who have studied it closely, one of the most strategically catastrophic. British Leyland was not run by people who loved engineering. It was run by committees, accountants, political pressures, and labour disputes that dragged on for years. The culture that had produced the Morris Minor, the culture that gave a single exceptional mind the space and the trust to follow an idea all the way through, was buried under layers of bureaucracy and short-term calculation. The Morris Minor was discontinued in 1971, after 23 years of continuous production, over 1,300,000 units built. And what they chose to replace it with, that is where this story takes a turn that still makes people shake their heads. The car chosen to replace the Morris Minor was the Morris Marina. Launched in 1971, the same year the Minor left the production line for the last time. On paper, the Marina was meant to be everything the modern buyer wanted, more conventional in its styling, larger inside, more competitive against the Ford Cortina, which was then dominating the British family car market. British Leyland needed volume. They needed something that looked like progress. What they built was a car constructed almost entirely on compromise. The front suspension was lifted nearly unchanged from the old Morris Minor, not as a tribute, not as a deliberate piece of cost-effective heritage engineering, but simply because it was available and cheap. They took one of the only remaining threads connecting the new car to Issigonis's thinking and pulled on it purely to save money. The handling was poor. Build quality was inconsistent from the factory floor. Reliability became a source of dark national humor rather than confidence. In the years that followed, the Morris Marina was voted one of the worst cars ever made in multiple British publications and television programs. It was not a niche, critical failure known only to automotive journalists. It was a broad, public embarrassment, and it was what British Leyland put in the place of a car that had, by every real measure, genuinely worked. The contrast is almost too stark to process. One man, one vision, one honest car, 23 years of production, over 1 million units, trusted by a nation. Then a committee, a compromise, and a catastrophe. But here is where the story shifts. The Morris Minor refused to disappear. In 1976, 5 years after the factory stopped building them, the Morris Minor Owners Club was founded. Today, it is one of the largest single-marque car clubs in the world, with members across Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, North America, and beyond. Replacement parts are still being manufactured. Full restorations are completed every year. Cars built in the early 1950s are still being driven on public roads, which is considerably more than can be said for most of what replaced them. That is not nostalgia. That is a verdict. There is a lesson in all of this, and it isn't really about cars. It's about what happens when you build something with genuine honesty. When you let a craftsman follow an idea without a committee softening every edge. When you design something around the real needs of the real person who will use it, not around a quarterly target, not around an executive's ambitions, not around what a marketing team believes the market wants this season. The Morris Minor lasted because it deserved to last. It worked because it was made by someone who was trying to get it right, not just trying to get it done. And the fact that the world moved on from it says far more about the world than it does about the car. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you these stories because they matter, and we need people around who still believe they do. Leave a comment below and tell me what the Morris Minor means to you. Maybe you owned one, maybe your parents did. Maybe it's just a shape from a memory you didn't know you still carried. Like the video if it earned it, and share it with someone who still believes things should be built to last. because those people are worth finding.